It's Christmas, and you know what that means? It's time for all the history YouTubers to make their videos on the Christmas truce, because it's always the Christmas truce. Here on the Embur channel, however, I have no plans of blending into the crowd. So instead of some sappy tale about soon-to-be corpses kicking a football around a pre-Poppy Flanders field, let me tell you a Christmas tale you've likely never heard of. There are certain events throughout history that you'd swear are fiction, something made up by a history YouTuber as a quick April Fool's gag. The War of the Bucket, the Anglo-Zanzibar conflict, and of course, our recent Q to end all Qs. But through all of these, I don't believe any of them quite hold a candle to the 1950s Scottish heist for the Stone of Destiny. It's a rather strange tale of courage, cooperation, and undermining the world's most powerful monarchy, and Glaswegians doing what Glaswegians do best. No, not heroin! I meant mildly annoying those around them. While the events of this heist have been resolved and the governments of England and Scotland have reconciled, the tale of the stone is one that's way too funny to not tell. Let's have a look at the only interesting event in 1950s Britain. The Stone of Destiny, the Stone of Scone, the Coronation Stone, whatever you want to call it, is nothing fancy. It's just a slab of sandstone with a small groove inside it. Despite this, the stone is still today one of the most important symbols of Scottish nationhood. In fact, you might have heard it in the news in the last few months. The origins of the stone are uncertain, but the most common story I've seen begins somewhere around the year 500 in the Kingdom of Dalriata. According to the story, the first King of Scots, Fergus the Great, brought the stone from Ireland to the site of his coronation in Argyll. From that point forth, every Scottish monarch would be crowned atop this legendary stone. Until those monarchs decided that England made for a pretty terrible suzerain. Despite maintaining their independence from England after the First Scottish War of Independence, King Edward I personally took the Stone of Destiny from Scone Abbey and brought it back to Westminster Abbey to be placed on his own throne. This would, under Scottish tradition, make him the rightful King of Scotland. England, though, agreed to return the stone to Scotland in 1328, but such a move was not popular with the English people back at home, and so the stone stayed. Westminster Abbey would remain the home of the stone for the next 6 centuries. Even through the Civil War, the World Wars, and the rise and fall of the Empire, the stone would remain sat within the confines of the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey. However, a group of ragtag university students from Glasgow would do what no Scot had done before. They were going to steal the stone. At the centre of our story, we have 4 unlikely heroes. The plan began with students Ian Hamilton and Gavin Vernon hatching a plan to remove the stone from Westminster Abbey in hopes of promoting a renewed sense of Scottish nationhood. As completely daft of a plan as it was, they had the connections to do it. They were both members of the Scottish Covenant, a society seeking Scottish devolution from London and presumably locked in battle with the English UNSC. With this connection, they were able to entice 2 more fellow Glasgow students, Kay Matheson and Alan Stewart, to help them with their plan. They also managed to acquire some funding for their operation from an unlikely source, a business at the Glasgow Tramway, who managed to hit them up with a handsome investment that has unfortunately been lost to time. With their unbreakable goal, their powers combined, and a little sprinkling of corporate backing, they were about to make history. Christmas Eve, 1950, the day our protagonists would set off on their nearly 20-hour journey down to London. Their journey was smooth and they arrived in the city around late afternoon. After convening at a Leon's Corner store, Leon's Corner houses are a type of department store-sized restaurant and cafe that existed in big cities in the UK during the 20th century. No, I hadn't heard of them either before doing this research, so I figured I might as well share this information with you all too. It's not like you'd ever learn this anywhere else. They decided to waste no time and have a crack at stealing the stone that very night. That night, Hamilton decided to go in by himself, hiding underneath a trolley in the Abbey to keep himself out of sight. Unfortunately, his daring attempts at stealth were thwarted by a single security guard, who saw him hiding behind a statue with his shoes in his hands. It's not known how Hamilton managed to talk his way out of that situation, but by some stroke of luck he was, sent out with a simple "Merry Christmas" from the guard. Their impromptu first attempt had failed, but despite these setbacks, the big day was upon them. Tomorrow would be their finest hour. Or at the very least, they'd have a good story to tell at the pub when they got back. The very next day, our sneaky Scottish swipers got back to work. If their previous attempt was the starter, this attempt was the second, third and fourth course of the meal. Christmas Day 1950, Vernon and Stewart got to work. Their first plan of action was reconnaissance. They needed to scout the building to find the quietest and quickest route to the coronation chair. The boys made their way to the Abbey, acting as curious Scottish tourists. They got themselves into a lengthy conversation with the Archdeacon about the stone and the building. At the same time, they managed to be within earshot of a conversation discussing the shifts of the guards that day. In a matter of an hour or two of moseying around the Abbey, they had learned everything they needed to know. It was time to take back the Stone of Destiny. That night, Vernon, Stewart and Hamilton entered the workers' yard in the Abbey, an entrance where the guards wouldn't expect anybody to come from. With a swift tug of a crowbar, they managed to break their way into the south side of the Abbey. After a few short minutes, they'd made it. They were now within the bounds of the shrine of Edward I, Malleus Scotorum himself. There was no time to be awestruck, however, as they only had a short amount of time before a guard would surely spot them. In a tragic accident, however, the constant pushing and shoving of all three of them trying to get the stone out caused the stone to fall and break into two. In a panic, Hamilton stuffed the larger piece of the stone in his coat and then immediately ran for the exit and out to the car, where Matheson was waiting to pick the boys up. Vernon and Stewart took a little while longer to arrive with the other half, but they made it just in time to escape from the scene without any of them being caught. At that moment, they'd done it. A ragtag group of students had just stolen the Stone of Destiny back for Scotland. With the stone's weight sagging down the car, Vernon feared that the police would notice and investigate. As such, the group dispersed. Stewart and Hamilton drove down to Kent and hid their half of the stone in a field, whereas Matheson drove to the Midlands to keep her part of the stone with a friend. Vernon himself would take no part of the stone, immediately leaving and taking the train back to Scotland. Of course, it didn't take long for the guards at Westminster Abbey to notice that the stone was missing, and so quickly alerted the Metropolitan Police. The following day, the border between England and Scotland would close for the first time since the Union of the Crowns. After the dust settled and the border restrictions were somewhat eased, the group managed to make their way back up to Scotland with the pieces of the stone to have them fixed. There they would acquire the talents of one Robert Gray, a stonemason and a fellow nationalist sympathiser. Gray would mend the stone, but not before inserting a little piece of paper into it. What that paper meant or had written on it is still unknown to this day, and I don't think anyone wants to break the stone in two again. From there, the stone was relocated to Arbroath Abbey, the location of the signing of the Declaration of Arbroath, which if you recall was mentioned in the first Union Jack video. Despite the best efforts of Scotland Yard, the stone would remain there unnoticed for many months more. After 4 months of investigation and searching cross-country, the boys at Scotland Yard had managed to finally find the stone at Arbroath Abbey. Despite this finding, it would take until February of the next year for the stone to return to its rightful place back down in Westminster. Eventually, the group too was sniffed out by the police. Upon questioning, all but one of them immediately confessed to their actions. Hamilton, though, the ever-crafty lawyer that he was, never directly confessed. While I'm sure the police would have loved nothing more than to throw these Clydesdale criminals in the local HMP, there wasn't much they could really do. The group were absolutely lauded back home in Scotland, being seen as modern national heroes. If the police were to incarcerate the students, it would turn a simple student prank into a full political action, and so our heroes returned to Scotland to live normal lives once more. Well, as normal as a life as possible when you're suddenly a national icon. At the time of the heist, Britain was a ruined but strongly united country. Neither Englishman nor Scotsman was spared from the horrors of the Second World War. As such, any notion of breaking up the Union at that point was tantamount to just siding with the Germans. That was until the heist. The daring tale of 4 Scottish students travelling down to London to rescue a long-lost Scottish artefact was one that cheered up many on both sides of the border. In England, nobody outside of the most ardent of royalists really cared about the stone anyway, if they even knew about it. So this all had about the same emotional weight as losing a sock in the tumble dryer. In Scotland, however, the students were seen as heroes. In a later interview, Vernon joked that after the heist, he never had to buy a beer for himself for the rest of his life. After the heist, the group would go their own separate ways. Ian Hamilton would go on to become an established lawyer in Scotland. He'd remain a staunch nationalist for the rest of his life, before eventually passing away in October 2022? That was 2 months ago! Gavin Vernon would go and emigrate to Canada in the 1960s, where he would work in the mining industry before passing away from cancer in March of 2004. Kay Matheson would go on to become a teacher and a political activist, campaigning for and promoting the use of the Gaelic language in education and society. She too would pass away in July 2013 at the ripe old age of 84. Alan Stewart would immediately retire from public life, pursuing a life of art collecting until his death in March 2019. And finally, the Stone of Destiny would remain in Westminster until 1996, when Prime Minister John Major had the stone returned to Scotland. The stone would lay in Edinburgh Castle until 2020, when it was relocated once again to Perth City Hall. After hundreds of years, the stone was able to finally catch a breath. As much as I know I should look down on these, essentially criminals, I can't help but admire them. For 4 Scottish students to go down and haphazardly yoink one of the most prized possessions in the Scottish crown in the matter of 48 hours is an incredibly admiring feat. Maybe this story will inspire you to try your hand at a daring heist yourself. Perhaps your country has a MacGuffin that's stranded in some other country and you want to get it back. You never know, maybe you'll be the next Ian Hamilton or Gavin Vernon. After all, the British Museum is right there for the taking. In the meantime, I'll be cozying up for the holiday season, and you probably should too. Spend some time with your friends and loved ones, play some games, listen to some music, indulge in that book you've been meaning to get around to. Whatever you decide to do this winter, I hope you enjoy it. Here's to a good and proper 2023, my friends. Wassail.